are we ready to start? Yeah, it's. And Sophie, can we?
Yeah,
know?
I'm ready.
Okay, so good afternoon now officially. Good afternoon, CLEA. Good afternoon, world. We are starting a next seminar. Today we have Sophie Meincke.
Yes.
Speaking to us from Vienna. A philosopher from Vienna, from the University of Vienna, and also a member of the Austrian Academy of Science. And the topic, you can all see the topic already, the development and evolution reconceived, lessons from process ontology. So we've been speaking a lot about process ontology, and Sophie was also participating in those discussions. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to to hear your thinking and your research on the topic. So Sophie, the floor is yours, and we are listening.
Thank you very much, Marta, for the kind introduction and for having me today. I'm very much looking forward to discussions. I also apologize for not being there in person. I would have preferred to be there, but this is beyond my control right now that I can't travel. Okay, development and evolution reconceived, lessons from process ontology. So, okay, why does this not work? Here we are. So there is a new movement in the philosophy of biology that takes itself to be inspired by process ontology, and that's why it's called process philosophy of biology, or also short process biology. And the key claim here is that organisms are processes rather than things or substances. I have quoted here myself, but there's my colleagues as well, John and Dan, and quite a couple of people, and I suspect also some of your group. But so here, this I'm just presenting my perspective here and looking forward to exchange on it. So, for example, I say scientific metaphysics of biology ought to do justice to the all-pervasive dynamicity of biological reality. Life is a process, and so are living beings, processes rather than things or substances. And John Dupre and Dan Nicholson say the world, at least insofar as living beings are concerned, is made up not of substantial particles or things, but of processes. It's dynamic through and through. And indeed, right? I mean, just look at these pictures. I think it's correct to say there is dynamicity at all levels of organization, in all of its dimensions, and at all timescales. So the aim of my talk now is to explore how such a processual perspective can inform our understanding of development and evolution. And I will proceed as follows. I will first actually clarify the notion of process ontology as opposed to thing ontology. And I will do so by taking a look at the history of Western metaphysics, so how this opposition actually has come about and developed over time. And on this basis, then, we can settle on an appropriate version of process philosophy of biology and figure out what process biology has to say about development and evolution, in each case in contrast to thing ontological accounts of development and evolution. So I think that it's really important to understand what it is that process biologists are arguing against. So I should say that I will not here present comprehensive accounts of development and process view of development and evolution, but rather outline a novel, more fitting theoretical framework within which such accounts then can be developed. And I hope there will be time for me to conclude then also with some remarks on how process biology, properly understood, underpins calls for an extended evolutionary synthesis. Good. History. The father of process ontology is Heraclitus, to whom the saying Pantarei is attributed. Everything flows. And I'm sure you also have heard that Heraclitus claimed that you cannot step into the same river twice. And I will come back to this. So the bottom line is, for Heraclitus, everything is in motion and becoming. However, Heraclitus had a rather powerful adversary, and this was Parmenides, who advocated for exactly the opposite of what Heraclitus held, namely for the thesis that nothing moves and change. There is no motion, no becoming. Instead, everything is stationary and unchanging being. Now, for Parmenides, there cannot be any becoming or change because becoming or change involves non-being. Something comes into being from non-being, and non-being, according to Parmenides' famous thesis, does not exist. He said being is and non-being is not. So for him, the very concept of change is incoherent, and hence the appearance of change is illusory. And accordingly, Parmenides conceived of being as an unchanging, ungenerated, indestructible whole, a sphere. Now, the fight between the pro-change and the contra-change stances has been going on in Western metaphysics ever since up until today, with the contra-change party, we could call them the non-changers, having the upper hand over the changers. A movement that tried to find a compromise between Heraclitus and Parmenides' stances on change was atomism. Best known proponents were Lysippus and Democritus. Based on the materialist presumption that everything results from natural laws, the atomists held that all that exists are tiny indivisible particles, which they called atoms. Bodies then would be aggregates of atoms, and change just consists in the difference between these arrangements of atoms. Well, and it's to be noted here that for the atomists, atoms actually move. So they're always in motion, which is a sort of Heraclitean element in the theory, while they, however, do not change themselves, which is the Parmenidean part. So atoms, in a sense, are Parmenidean objects. So that's the sort of compromise that the atomism tried to achieve. But of course, there's an open question. So how do these atoms bind together? I mean, they're just aggregates, like floating around, building and all different aggregates. But would we count these aggregates as real objects, actually? There's another philosopher to be mentioned here, and that is Aristotle. Aristotle provided an answer to this question, how atoms bind together, that effectively refuted atomism. And he thereby offered also an alternative kind of middle ground between Heraclitus and Parmenides. How? Well, according to Aristotle, the world is populated by substances. And substance is a term of art in philosophy. And you might know, I mean, it has all sorts of different meanings. The meaning that Aristotle here invokes is that of a concrete particular that is neatly bounded and ontologically independent of anything else. And more specifically, he proposed what is known as hylomorphism. That's the idea that the substance is a composite of matter and form. And form here is the unifying principle. So that is what determines the substance's potentialities, including the changes it may undergo. So it provides the essence of a thing by defining the set of immutable properties this thing has. So there's those properties the thing can't lose without ceasing to exist. And on the other hand, he thought that there are some accidental properties that actually can change without affecting the identity of the substance. So for example, if I go to the hairdresser to have my hair dyed, I would still exist afterwards. I would just look differently. But if I suddenly started meowing and walking on 4 legs, this would mean, according to Aristotle, it's actually not me, but a numerically distinct being doing these things. So I would have ceased to exist. Supposedly, I would have been replaced with cat in that case. Now, Aristotle's substance ontology lives on in contemporary substratum theories of objecthood. According to this theory, an object or a concrete particular is made up of its properties and an underlying substratum. Say, we could compare it to a bundle of balloons tied up to a rug. Now, this corresponds with the way we speak. We attribute properties to a thing that bears them. For example, we could say the rug is green, soft, and rectangular. And green, soft, rectangular would be these properties compared to the balloons. 3 of those balloons you can see here in the image. Well, the point here is that the properties in the thing that bears them are supposed to be distinct, which implies that we can apprehend the bearer independently of its attributes. And that's why this bearer is called a bare particular. And then accordingly on that basis, we can conceptualize change as a change in the composition of the bundle of properties, the balloons, by holding fixed our rock, the bad particular. Sounds great, but unfortunately it's incoherent. The very concept of a bad particular is incoherent because it's supposed to be something that has no properties while actually bearing properties. And likewise, it's supposed to be something that does not change while bearing change. So make sense of it. It's just plain contradiction. Now, we could try to avoid this problem by switching to another type of theory of objecthood that is discussed in contemporary analytic metaphysics, and that's the bundle theory. Now, this theory claims that objects are constituted exclusively by the properties that are attributed to them. So there is no underlying substratum. So in other words, we keep the balloons but get rid of the rock. Objects then are just bundles of properties, and that's an idea that can be traced back to David Hume. Unfortunately, we run into problems again. Bundles are subject to so-called mereological essentialism, so their identity is defined by their elements. Take one of these balloons away and you have a different bundle. So in other words, whereas the substratum theory gives us a self-contradictory, incoherent account of change, the bundle theory eliminates the possibility of change altogether. And on top of this, the problem that was faced already by atomism returns. So how do the properties actually bind together? So is there a single object at all? Well, or is a bundle of balloon an object? And I think everybody who has had a bundle of balloons in their hands knows that there's something wrong with calling a bundle of balloons an object. We could try to fix this problem by applying a trick. I call it a trick, and you will see why. So what we could do is imagine our bundle of properties to be stretched out, not only in space, but also in time. And then we chop it up. So it would be then a four-dimensional object that is extended across a particular region of what is called space-time. And then we chop it up into different space-time chunks or slices, each of which then is a different bundle of properties. And we claim that this object, the four-dimensional object, then changes in the sense of having different spatial-temporal parts with different properties. And furthermore, we postulate that there's some kind of continuity relation. It's often called unity relation that links the different spatial temporal parts. Now, the theory was advocated, for example, famously by William van Orben Quine and also David Lewis, and it's known for dimensionalism. Lewis in particular has argued that only this so-called perdurance account of persistence is able to evade the looming contradiction inherent in change, namely the one and the same entity has different properties, which according to Leibniz's law is impossible. So two entities are numerically identical only if they have identical properties, but change is defined as the change of properties. So how can anything then still be the same thing, right? And that's called the problem of temporary intrinsics. Well, four-dimensionalism has continued to fascinate analytic metaphysicians ever since, despite its serious problems. So, for example, we must accept that change is in principle no different from spatial variation. So if I say I'm sad today and I will be happy tomorrow, this, according to four dimensions, is just like basically, or they're saying I'm having a sad temporal part and I have a happy temporal part, which is just like having a nose-shaped spatial part and a leg-shaped spatial parts. But more seriously even, it's not clear whose variation we're actually speaking about. So the binding relations are notoriously weak and fail to turn the four-dimensional entity into anything more than a mereological sum. But then, if all we have is different things with different properties, then what does actually change? I think the answer is nothing changes here. So our tour de force through the history of counter-reactions to Heraclitus reveals a shared pattern. appeal to things as the primary building blocks of reality. No, primary does not necessarily mean elementary here. So it's just what comes first in the order of relevance or fundamentality in metaphysics, on the construction of reality. So of course I should tell you what a thing is. And I use this term in a technical sense. So thing I define as an entity for the identity of which change is not essential. And setting aside Parmenides' notion of being as a one undivided whole or sphere, I think there are two main kinds of things that are typically invoked by thing ontologists. And that's complex things or substances on one hand, and elementary simple things like atoms, events, properties on the other. And these two kinds of things correspond with two versions of thing ontology, and that's substance ontology and Humean ontologies, or neo-Humenians, right? So Hume, Lewis, Quine, and so on, they all fall into that side. Both versions of thing ontology consider change and process as parasitic on the identity of things. So either it's assumed that change is born by an unchanging bearer, substance or substratum, or change is thought to be a variation between different, numerically different things, as it is the case in four-dimensionalism. In each case, it is change that presumably requires explanation, whereas the identity of the thing is taken for granted. And that is due to the underlying conviction that change and identity are incompatible. And that's the reason why ultimately change is not only downgraded, but effectively eliminated altogether. And if you want to know more about this metaphysical issue, then you can consult a paper of mine here. So thing ontology is driven by a deeply entrenched fear of change. Thing ontologists suspect that if one does away with things, as process ontologists propose, the world turns into a chaotic place without structure. However, this assumption is the result of misrepresentation or even deliberate slander. Here's how Plato paraphrases Heraclitus' doctrine. Heraclitus taught, he said, that all things pass and nothing stays, and comparing existing things to the flow of a river, he says you could not step twice into the same river. But what Heraclitus actually said was, on those stepping into rivers staying the same, other and other waters flow. So processes change, and through changing, remain the same over time. Now, exactly this view is to be found in Bergson, another process philosopher. So Bergson insists, contrary to what language and perception seem to suggest, that change does not require an unchanging substratum. He says there are changes, but there are underneath the change no things which change. Change has no need of support. There are movements, but there's no inert or invariable object which moves. Movement does not imply immobile. This, however, for Bergson, does not mean that there is no identity. Instead, he says change is, in fact, the most substantial and durable thing possible. For Bergson, time is at the heart of reality. So time here is to be properly understood, namely, as Bergson argues extensively in a number of writings, as duration or durée, which is an indivisible continuation of change. So therefore, to say that reality is fundamentally temporal is to say that reality is irreducibly and all-pervasively dynamic. And I think Bergson comes up with an interesting and rather compelling explanation as to why we tend to overlook this dynamicity. And so this is the illusion that reality consists of static things. This stems from our tendency to spatialize time. And the metaphysical doctrine of four-dimensionalism is a manifestation of exactly this tendency. So for the space-time does not move, it is divisible like space in slices or portions. And so we can say the very idea of space-time amounts to a conceptual elimination of change. Because, according to Bergson, generally it is impossible to construct change from something unchanging, right? So you can do it the other way around. So there is a story about how you can arrive from change to the idea of something unchanging, but it doesn't work the other way around. And I think there's a reason why there's increasing interest now among various kinds of philosophical circles, including analytic metaphysics, in sort of getting engaged with Bergson's thought. And I have myself just published something on this, how Bergson can help process philosophy in biology as well. Of course, the name most commonly associated with process philosophy is Alfred North Whitehead, thanks to his book, Process and Reality, where he claims the actual world is process and process the becoming of actual entities, with these actual entities being completed processes, and that is events. And for Whitehead, this implies that their being cannot be understood without taking into account how they became what they are, and that is as becoming. He also advocated for a philosophy of organism. He thought that everything is organic and also everything is at least minimally sentient. Now, I should say that at least that branch of process biology that I'm coming from, we're not so much inspired by Whitehead. I know there are different traditions as well. One reason is that his philosophy is quite speculative, and it parts also a little bit obscure, but maybe that's just limited to my due to my limited understanding skills, or whatever. But so, though he is certainly an important figure in process philosophy, it's not that philosophy that is the historical background for the kind of process biology that I'm advocating for. But generally we can say, so drawing on these historical models provided by Heraclitus, Bergson, and to some extent also Whitehead, we can characterize process ontology as an ontology that takes processes to be ontologically fundamental. And of course, I need to give you a definition of a process, again, used as a technical term. It is an entity for whose identity change is essential. So a process must change and move in order to exist. Take the river again as an example. So if the river doesn't move and change water, that wouldn't be a river, right? So change then is taken to be not only compatible, but in fact constitutive of identity. So as I said, there's no same identical river without this type of change, and the right change needs to occur. And so accordingly, identity is not something that is given as a primitive or something you can take for granted, but it's rather being produced processually through changes of the right kind, those that bring about stabilization. So it is stability, in fact, not change, that requires explanation, and it can be thus explained by our sciences. And that's something that sort of comes out of the theory and also on the methodological side. So to claim that processes are ontologically fundamental implies that things, again in the technical sense of the term, if there are any, are secondary to processes by being brought about by them. So things are processes just stabilized at certain time scales comparable to eddies in the sea. We are ready to turn now to process biology. Process biology, or process philosophy of biology, is just process ontology applied to the biological domain. So that is to life and the living. Now this sounds straightforward, but there's a little bit more to the story. So just as there are different versions of process ontology, and I highlighted only three, Heraclitus, Bergson, and Whitehead, so there are different versions of process philosophy of biology. So process biology is far from homogeneous, and this is often overlooked in particular by critics. So 2 remarks on this. So to say that there are different versions of process biology is not to say that anything goes, in the sense that any theory that somehow incorporates processes in the explanation of biological phenomena is therefore to be regarded as a process philosophy of biology. Processes indeed should be fundamental in that theory. And in fact, some of what is currently advertised as process biology, I think, is actually not process biology. And against the historical background that I just presented, you will easily see why. Here's an example, and that's new mechanism, a popular movement in the philosophy of biology since the turn of the 21st century. So the new mechanist's agenda is to understand the complexity of living systems by identifying mechanisms. Now, what are mechanisms? As Peter Mackemore, Lindley Durden, and Carl Craven, commonly abbreviated as MDC in the landmark paper, put it, mechanisms are entities and activities organized such that they are productive or regular changes from start or setup to finish or termination conditions. And other new mechanists also speak, instead of activities, of processes here. So entities and processes. And I had a number of conversations in which new mechanists were explaining to me that their approach is compatible or even complementary with process biology. Now, is this true? Mechanistic explanations, Bill Bechtel and Robert Richardson first pointed out in their 1993 book, works by decomposition and localization. So living systems decompose into structural parts. The subtasks performed by the parts are located, and here is the guiding assumption that by then putting it all back together, one gets an explanation of the overall phenomenon, just as with the machine. So the behavior, it's a quote, of the machine is a consequence of the parts and the organization. Now, this implies that the parts of a mechanism are identifiable independently of the mechanism in which they are found. So that is independently of the activities in which these parts are involved. And this is actually what Stuart Glennon and other mechanists says. He says the parts of mechanism must have a kind of robustness in reality apart from the place within that mechanism. It should in principle be possible to take the part out of the mechanism and consider its properties in another context. But here's a problem. Where are the robust parts whose identity is context independent in metabolism? Metabolism surely qualifies as a mechanism in the MDC sense. Well, recall, mechanisms are entities and activities organized such that they are productive or regular changes from start to setup or finish of termination conditions. So you see here a schematic depiction of the metabolism of the cell. The existence of membrane boundaries through which the exchange of matter and energy with the environment takes place permits then the bounded dynamics of the metabolic network, which again produces the metabolites that constitute the membrane boundaries. So, of course, the membrane boundaries prima facie may appear robust, but they are in fact totally dependent on the context. So they both contribute to and result from the process of metabolism. At the same time, the metabolites don't even exist long enough to be called robust, let alone can one have any without metabolism. So actually, the only thing that could be called robust is the dynamic and self-recursive organization of metabolism itself. And this is actually what Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela have described as under the title of autopoiesis, which translates to self-production or self-constitution. So according to them, any system exhibiting autopoietic organization counts as a living system, no matter what its matter is. And they define it as a network of processes of production of components such that these components continuously regenerate and realize the network that produces them and constitute the system as a distinguishable unity in the domain in which they exist. So that's the very idea of autopoiesis, that there are material components only as part of the network of processes of production of components. So you cannot somehow tear them apart, components, material components, and the processes that produce them within this sort of self-recursive organization. And the same also holds true, as I've shown in another paper, for the more recent theory of biological autonomy that was proposed by Alvaro Moreno and his colleagues, for example, Matteo Mosio, which presents a sort of more refined version of autopoiesis theory. So biological autonomy is defined as a living system ability to actively maintain itself. And it has two dimensions. So there's the constitutive dimension, also called basic autonomy, which is basically just metabolic self-constitution or autopoiesis, and the interactive dimension, the adaptive interaction with the environment, also called agency. And this interactive dimension is actually entailed in autopoiesis, but it needs to be made more prominent, given the fact that it evolutionary has stepwise been decoupled from the basic processes of metabolic self-constitution. So agency, in a more interesting, robust sense, for a living system means to maintain its self-constitution through interactively promoting favorable environmental conditions. Now, my own version of process biology builds on the conceptions of autopoiesis and biological autonomy, but also being inspired, especially with respect to the general ontological foundations, by elements of Bergson's philosophy. So I take it that organisms, ontologically speaking, are higher order processes that stabilize themselves through constant interaction with surrounding processes. So there is no organism beyond this process of interactive self-stabilization. Just think about it. If the organism stops metabolizing, it ceases to exist. And a philosopher who has pointed out in particular the all-pervasiveness of metabolism is also Hans Jonas. It's really worth reading. So that organisms are higher order process means that there are lower level processes on which organisms qua higher order processes depend, and which they at the same time also modulate according to their needs. So there's a processual ontological interdependence within and across levels of organization. And because of that, reductionist approaches such as the one advocated for by the new mechanists are, I think, bound to fail. Besides the fact that new mechanism is not a process account, because it doesn't take process to be fundamental. So one can't build organisms from parts like a house from bricks. Biological identity then is both, I think, processual, and it has organizational depth. It's a matter of ongoing stabilization efforts at all organizational levels. And as such, it comes in degrees, as opposed to strict and primitive substance identity, which is one or all or nothing identity. So either there is the strict identity or the thing doesn't exist anymore. At the same time, this processual identity is also more robust than the stitched together identity of four-dimensional bundles, or things could never be, or bundle of balloons. Metaphysically, we may say that organisms are processes that are continuums, processual continuums, and who happens to know a bit of metaphysical discourse knows that this is a really heretic claim, because traditionally so-called continuums were equated with substances. But and this is actually a strong argument, I think, why there is this special metaphysical status of living processes and the robustness they have. Well, this has to do with the fact that organisms enact their own identity, that they are at least minimally agents. Now, these are only the very basics of my view. It's not my full view, which I can't present here for reasons of time. And also it's still in the making. But here is just an overview of this, at least 7 key elements of this view. I talked about biological organization already a little bit, biological autonomy, autopoiesis, and so on. Thereby also touching issues in causality, which is the second point here on the slide, by pointing to the interdependence between higher and lower level processes. Also portrayed biological identity as processual, but being constituted by change. And then there are also further elements like processual notions of biological time, biological subjectivity, biological agency, which I mentioned, and biological freedom. This is not an exhaustive list. There are more elements. For example, creativity or normativity and teleology are also important points I could say a lot about, but not today. The point here is these 7 key elements will suffice to help us figure out what a genuine process account of development should look like. And of course, now we need to say something about what development actually is meant to be. Well, curiously, it's often talked about, but seldom defined. So I actually looked into a biological textbook and strikingly did not find a definition anywhere. So here's what Dupré and Nicholson in their widely read manifesto for a processual philosophy of biology say. All organisms undergo characteristic series of morphological and behavioral changes over the course of their lifetime. Okay, so development is about change of an individual organism during what is called its ontogeny, which literally means the coming to be of an organism. And ontogeny is part of an organism's life cycle. So the sequence of life stages that an organism undergoes from birth to reproduction, ending with the production of offspring. But as you can see in this image, the stages of life cycle can differ radically from one another. So potentially calling into question that we are really dealing with one and the same individual here. So there is a challenge here to reconcile identity with change. Here is James de Frisco's suggestion as to how to handle this problem. He says, qualitative variation between successive stages in the life of a biological system can make it difficult to specify an identical subject that passes through these stages. It is easier to simply drop the requirement that persistence is identity over time and instead to construe it as a mereological relationship among the stages themselves. But this means discarding the category of substance as a paradigm for individuality in favor of the weaker and more flexible category of process. I defend the view that process lack the categorical features of numerical identity over time, persisting instead by having temporal parts. Is this really what process biologists think or should think? No, I think. Actually, it is false packaging. The packaging says process, but there's no actual process inside. De Frisco falls for the 4D trick. So he attributes different properties to different things, to the processes, different temporal parts or stages, which themselves do not change. That's the idea. This time it's not balloons, but stages of an animal's life cycle. Like this, you recognize this. However, process ontology we found is an ontology according to which processes are ontological, fundamental, and it's not the case here. So such a juxtaposition or aggregate or mereological sum of static things is not a process. It's not an entity for whose identity change is essential. Now, I should say that de Frisco, while he denies numerical identity processes, is prepared to grant them having some causal cohesion. So this is what ties together the different temporal parts. So he says that sort of this is coming about through an interaction gradient, such that the interactions among the entities parts are stronger than the interactions with the environment. Now, this is great, but where is this in this picture? All what we get here are static snapshots of an ongoing process, supposedly interactively bringing about causal cohesion. A process whose organizational structure, unfortunately, totally remains in the dark. So when it comes to identity, it seems as if substance ontology had a point against process ontology. At any rate, it seems like this also to Dupré and Nicholson. They say one could attempt to retain the commitment to substance ontology by arguing that despite the developmental transformations organisms undergo, they nevertheless remain the same thing or substance throughout. However, they insist that substance ontology is not up to the task of making sense of development. So they continue, the problem with this line of argument is that it's surprisingly difficult to specify what stays the same throughout the life cycle of an organism. When we consider a fertilized egg, an embryo, tadpole, froglet, and then an adult frog, it is not clear what properties so these different stages, all share beyond being temporal stages of the same individual process. In fact, there may well be no interesting properties shared at all by all. Is this a successful way to attack substance ontological states takes on development? No, I think it's not. Helen Stewart, who is a prominent contemporary advocate of substance ontology, has an easy time with refuting this attack. She simply rejects the idea that substance identity must be grounded in some interesting property predicable of the developing organism throughout the life cycle. So she suggests as an alternative approach, for living systems, what supplies the ground of identity are facts not about the maintenance of static properties throughout the various processes of alteration and transformation, but rather facts about the regular structure and nature of the changes themselves, which those organisms tend to undergo. And more specifically, she suggests two criteria of identity, namely spatial temporal continuity of the material elements involved in changes and a consistency of the form of these changes across species members. So according to Stewart, the substance ontologists need not deny that organisms change or drastically change in the course of their development. On the contrary, these changes exactly provide a criterion of identity insofar as they are characteristic of all members of a species. So then that the butterfly starts out as a larva, turns into chrysalis, continuous life as a flying insect, and so on. That is what makes a butterfly a butterfly. And as you will see, the mention of form in this context is actually significant because Stewart here appeals to a neo-Aristotelian version of substance ontology. So for Aristotle, in the case of living beings, which are the paradigmatic substances for him, form amounts to a principle of change and of staying unchanged, and as such grounds an organism's diachronic identity. And only natural substances have this principle of change in themselves. We find a similar idea promoted by David Wiggins, another metaphysician. He calls it a principle of activity, that there is a distinctive source of development and change that is shared by members of a natural kind. And actually, often with reference to this principle of activity, substance ontologists like to point out to process ontologists like me how much they actually like change, and that substance ontology, at least of an Aristotelian kind, is a sort of process ontology. But is this true? I think it's not. In fact, Stewart's and Wiggins' proposals bear all the marks of thing ontology, because change is grounded in something that is unchanging, in an organism's identity constitutive form, right? This is also what you see here. So this reference to the natural kind. So there's the idea there's an essence that defines what it is to be a member of this particular kind. And there is no story about how this essence comes about. So it is something that defines what changes the animal, for example, can undergo, but it is itself supposed to be unchanging. And well, that's what we know as the sort of core idea of thing ontology. And accordingly, grounding development in an unchanging form also doesn't really give us an explanation of how development comes about and why it is as it is. And that has to do with Aristotle's idea that generally development movements are the realization of a potential and entelechy that is defined by the living substance's form or soul. So the particular development any animal undergoes is predefined by this form. So basically, a frog just develops differently from a butterfly because it has a frog soul rather than a butterfly soul. And if we ask then, okay, why do organisms have this form of soul they have, or how do these forms come to exist? Well, there are not really informative answers to this. Well, when it comes to the latter question, we cannot say anything about this because forms for Aristotle and species, as you know, are taken to be eternal, unchangeable. And when it comes to the former question, the answer will always be, okay, so in case of animals, forms are inherited by the father of the animal because the form is contained in the semen. So I will go quickly to this with an eye to time. You might know, so hylomorphisms is a quite gendered story. So the male semen transmits the form, and the female just sort of is like an oven providing the heat for this form to develop by itself. I worked a little bit on metaphysics of pregnancy, so it's a very interesting topic to see. Interesting to see how these old Aristotelian ideas are still around, and the idea that basically the womb functions as a sort of container for the developing embryo. You will still find this in discussions about whether there is a potential, intrinsic active potential towards personhood in human embryos, for example. But the interesting point is that then at some point a link happens between this old Aristotelian idea of an entelechy and genes. So, for example, we find this in Gomez Lobo here. All living beings have within themselves this active potentiality that scientists today view as encoded in their genome. Or he says, personhood is a function of our DNA. So here the idea that basically genes are fixed essences that determine characters with little or no contributions from environmental factors. So ultimate explanations of developmental outcomes are believed to be genetic. But we know, meanwhile, that this is not how things are, and what we find instead fits, I think, with the process view of biological organization, because there simply is no development without environment. And I can just again indicate this is a whole wealth of empirical data one can look into and find this as support for a process view. Just let's look into mammalian embryogenesis. We know that it's highly dependent on intrinsic successively generated information. For example, positional information, maternal, hormonal, and plasmatic information, epigenetic information, and so on. I mean, you can just say the containment view of pregnancy is false. I advocated for a view of mother and fetus as a hyper-complex process in a recent paper in Philosophical Studies. But similar things apply to embryogenesis of other species and phyla as well. So, for example, avian embryogenesis is dependent on temperature, humidity, or the eggs being turned. And, well, not to mention, say, developmental symbiosis, the fact that basically interactions that occur between host and persistent symbiotic microorganisms are crucial for development, as we meanwhile know, and so on. And this doesn't stop actually with birth, but continues after birth with nutrition, parental care, the ecological niche, and so on. Also, in accordance with the process view of biological causality, we find that causation does not travel in one direction only, from the genes to higher levels of organization, but that, on the contrary, genes themselves need a very specific environment in order to do anything at all. And that's something that, especially Dennis Noble in his work, has pointed out, that there is not only upward causality, but also downward causation. We find causation basically going up and down all the time, and this being intertwined, which matches with the self-recursive model of processual organization. That also means that development is the product of ongoing concerted effort, which is predicted by a process view of biological identity. So what is being produced does not already somehow exist beforehand, potentially in some minimal form, homunculus or genetic program. Instead, that development is really a genuinely creative process. So it's able to give rise to unforeseen and possibly unforeseeable novelties. I also think an implication of the process perspective is that the common focus on an organism's mature form is integrative, because development does not stop with maturity. Aging, census, and dying are developmental stages too. So in fact, Aristotelians struggle to explain why organisms age and die. So do they have an intrinsic potential towards death, right? that doesn't really sound plausible. Time, of course, is very important as well. It's, I think, internal to organisms, and it's indivisible in the Bergsonian sense, directional and irreversible. So therefore, it doesn't come as a surprise that the timing of environmental cues and their synchronization with the organism's internal temporal profile or developmental process is key to development. So there's research on these so-called timer mechanisms and so on. There's even a theory that shows that changes in the developmental timing of events relative to an ancestral form could have given rise to new species by changing the morphology. This apparently has been shown for the emu versus chicken wing developments. It's a highly exciting field of research. When it comes to subjectivity, I just want to mention this exciting work was done by Michael Levin and colleagues. He claims that basically there is spatial cognition even in cells, and cells interact together in a cognitive manner to bring about development. And well, to say that means that there is agency, so organisms enact their development in some sense. I could talk about this very long, and I don't have the time, so I would just to mention what a very, very basic notion of biological freedom also could look like when it comes to development. We're just talking about plasticity, so the sort of settling of what has not been settled yet, to speak in Hans Stewart's term. So there are decisions made, you know, this one in the epigenetic landscape. So there's an openness towards several possibilities, which then is determined within the developmental processes, including the time that is important here in the environmental interaction, which I mentioned before. And this is something that can be scaled up. I think it's important to know that biological freedom encompasses all levels of organization. Now, evolution. Not much time for me to talk about it yet. I mentioned in the beginning that I would contrast the process view of evolution with the thing ontological conception. And that might be surprising, because would a thing ontological conception of evolution not be again a sort of self-contradictory thing? Evolution is about change, right? Species change over time, new species emerge, others become extinct, and so on. And indeed, as you all know, evolutionary theory started out as an attack on the Aristotelian worldview, on which species are fixed or eternal. So there was definitely a very strong push towards change. I'm not going into this because you know about Lamarck, who was the first to claim that species actually change over time, namely through interactions with the environment, which then would become somehow inheritable, which he called soft inheritance. And then Darwin was there, who actually claimed, well, no, all species descended from a common ancestor, and then he came up with the theory of natural selection, because he was himself into breeding, especially these white doves. They had a particular name, which I forgot. So he came to the theory that basically, just as a breeder picks out individual plants or animals, so for certain desirable traits, so natural selection selects those that are the fittest in the ongoing struggle for existence. And as you all know, people were convinced of the existence of evolution, but not so much of the existence of natural selection, because Darwin couldn't explain the mechanism of inheritance. And it took quite a while, and it was a complicated story, which I also will skip here, until we finally arrived what is known as the modern synthesis, where basically people then came to the conclusion, sort of making a synthesis between Mendelian aspects and Darwinian aspects, that evolution is the gradual cumulative change in gene frequencies in populations brought about by selection acting on the variation among individuals that results from random gene mutation and recombination. And what is obvious here is this definition does not include environment-induced variation as a source of evolution. Well, this is in line with the central dogma of molecular biology, the idea that genetic information flows from DNA to proteins, but not vice versa. So it's definitely contra Lamarck, and led to the idea that organisms are just vehicles of genes and so on. Now, the point that matters here is that I think that the modern synthesis faces a problem of disappearing change. So if inheritance happens through self-replication of genes with no input from the environment, so we can actually ask how can any change actually come about, right? So there need to be variation for selection to work on. So all we have is sexual recombination, which is sort of conceptualized as the aggregations of atoms in atomism, right? So it's just a shuffling around of unchanging atomic things, or what happens is random gene mutation. So which, however, is always sort of a case when something goes wrong. Otherwise, atoms are supposed to stay the same. So in a sense, I think what we can say, change is sort of superficial. Vehicles may change, genes mostly don't unless something goes wrong. And change, if there is any, is parasitic upon unchanging things, which are genes. And so we could say that in the background of the modern synthesis, there's a kind of thing ontology of genes. And this is something many people are not satisfied with anymore. And these are those people who advocate for what is called the extended evolutionary synthesis. So the thing here is to say that we need to return to an earlier development and organism-centered view by stressing the importance of developmental processes, as Kevin Leyland says, that operate through developmental bias, inclusive inheritance, niche construction, share responsibility for the direction and rate of evolution, the origin of character variation, and the organism-environment complementarity. Okay, evolution is the evolution of new species, but then what actually are species? And since the seminal contributions by Gieslin and Hall, has become standard view to see species not as classes, but as individuals. Because in order for them to be units of evolution, species must be spatial, temporal, continuous, and this is not the case with classes. So then the idea is organisms would be parts rather than members of species. Now, there is a problem. How can an individual be made up of discrete and independent parts? And here's a solution proposed by my colleagues. The solution consists in the suggestion that species and facts are lineages, and it is temporally extended processes. And if so, then we can try to establish the identity of species lineages by postulating causal links between temporal stages. Causal relations, they say, between temporal stages of a lineage and between spatial parts of these temporal stages are responsible for providing that lineage with whatever integrity it has as an individual process. Now, you can already anticipate that I'm not happy with this because it seems to suggest that species lineages are four-dimensional space-time ones. So if there is such a process, a lineage, we must think, here's the picture which you will recognize. But I think if there is such a process as a lineage, we must think of it as being indivisible and dynamic. However, I would also like to raise the question in what sense one can actually reasonably claim a lineage process exists at all. Dupré and Nicholson make a rather strong and I think puzzling point. They say it could seem that just as organisms persist by renewing the cells that compose them through constant metabolic turnover, so lineages persist by replacing the organisms that make them up through continuous cycles of reproduction. But it seems to me or I'm just puzzled by the fact that they attribute agency to lineages, because it seems to me that if anybody acts here, it's organisms, not lineages. So this is here, right? So the lineages is nothing else than a series of these life cycles of individual organisms. And they act, but the species lineage does not. So to say then that lineages evolve is to say that there is, as Maturana Varela put it, a history of change in sequentially realized autopoiesis, where they actually think, well, the sort of structure, the autopoietic organization is the same in every living system, but the ways it is realized, these ways are subject to change. And so for Maturana and Varela, it's really crucial to distinguish between ontogeny as the history of transformation of a unity, where identity is not interrupted, and evolution as the process of historical change, of a succession of identities. So they say that the evolving pattern of realization of autopoiesis, or interactive self-stabilization, as I would call it, exists in a different domain than the unities that embody it. Now, taking this proviso into account, what would our process view of evolution then be? Well, to start with, I think we should conceive of evolution as a higher order dynamical process that is embodied and enacted by multi-level units of selection, most importantly by organisms or holobionts, but also cells within organisms or groups of organisms. I actually haven't included species here in this list because I don't think they exist, ontologically speaking. Species or species lineages are artificial divisions of a continuum of chains of life cycles. And likewise, I doubt that genes are units of selection. So in accordance with the extended evolutionary synthesis, a process view ought to regard genes as means used by organisms to survive individually and to facilitate continuation of the lineage, so sort of means of cross-generational stabilization. So in a sense, genes are the deep-seated memory of the lineage that can be used as seen fit in a given environment and situation, but genes must not be reified into essences. And speaking of reification, I would also warn against reifying natural selection. So there is just no invisible breeder going around selecting some individuals for breeding while dismissing others. So it's just organisms doing stuff that either does or does not contribute to their fitness. And this means that all the characteristics that evolution has, it has because of the characteristics of organisms, which are the 7 that I already mentioned before. So organisms contribute towards evolution in at least these 7 ways, which are the key characteristics of living systems, according to my version of process biology. Good, time to sum up. What have I done? I have first, via an excursion into the history of Western metaphysics, distinguished process ontology from its powerful opponent, thing ontology. Process ontology takes reality to be irreducibly dynamic, which is to say that processes, not things, are ontologically fundamental. An important implication of this is, as we've seen, that change, rather than being a threat to identity, as it's always suspected by thing ontologists, is in fact constitutive of identity. Second, I have presented my version of a process philosophy of biology that rightly bears the name, I think. I mean, people might disagree with me, or they will disagree with me, but that's okay. So I conceive of organisms as interactively self-stabilizing higher order processes, and I have outlined the 7 key elements of a comprehensive process view of life that I'm developing. So these are organization, causation, identity, time, subjectivity, agents, and freedom. In the third step, I have then applied these 7 key elements to development, and shown how a process perspective makes development comprehensible as being environment dependent, both upward and downward causal, creative, minimally cognitive, enacted and plastic, as opposed to thing ontological views that regard genes as unchanging essences that sort of provide a blueprint for development. Process biology, we've seen, provides a fitting conceptual framework for making proper sense of development in the light of recent empirical findings. Finally, I've offered a reconceptualization of evolution as the process of historical change of the ways interactive self-stabilization is realized, which is facilitated by organisms in at least the 7 respects presented earlier. So these are the same aspects that also turn out to be crucial to understand development. So to put organisms at the center of evolution as agents, so beings that enact their own survival and persistence, is to put development back into evolution, which is sort of the agenda also of the extended evolutionary synthesis. Now, I think, and these are sort of my final remarks here, it has become clear that I hope it has become clear that the neo-Darwinian disregard of development is rooted in a thing ontological commitment, or a bunch of thing ontological commitments. So here, self-replicating genes function as the basic building blocks of biological reality. And as a result, then evolutionary change becomes hard to explain. In contrast, change does not disappear in the extended evolutionary synthesis account of evolution, because genetic essentialism, determinism, reductionism, and so on is being dismissed here. And this is in line with process biology. So process biology can provide a theoretical framework that underpins the EES key move to appreciate the evolutionary relevance of development, developmental plasticity, niche construction, parental care, social interactions, and so on. And process biology can additionally deliver resources that, with respect to so far underexplored aspects, I think it would be worth looking into, for example, cognition, agency, for which all of this is being done already, and also the notion of freedom. So I would therefore like to end with the recommendation that the extended evolutionary synthesis be, so to speak, synthesized with the right version of process biology as a kind of synthesis of the synthesis, or put it differently, that the ES be further extended to include valuable lessons from process ontology. Thank you very much for your attention.
We can now, you have already unshared? Just
yes, I've shared, yeah.
All right, everyone, who would like to start? Questions, comments? Francis. Operating the camera. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie, for a very interesting talk, which is very close to the part of what we have been working on here in CLEA, in particular, the work I've been doing on relational agency. What we are doing on the Templeton project, where we are building this kind of process model of the origin of goal-directedness. I wanted to make one general remark, that is that the examples you give in biology are the examples where the thing ontology is kind of most obvious, in the sense you're speaking about individual animals, like, for example, a butterfly. And then you can say, yes, a butterfly comes from a caterpillar, so there is a process of development going on. But it's still easy for people to have kind of the intuition that this is one single individual, that the butterfly is just a form of a caterpillar, or the caterpillar is a butterfly in space. But if now we would go to a different part of biology, and we would look at plants, at fungi, at bacterial colonies, at ecosystems, there the whole notion of a well-formed individual becomes immediately very vague. I would take just a simple example of a tree. We all have this kind of standard view of a tree, like a tree trunk like that with leaves on top. But depending on where the tree grows, whether it breaks, whether it's cut, it can have all possible shapes, and you can have giant trees that in particular circumstances will remain just low bushes, and in other circumstances they will become very straight, and in other circumstances they will branch. And if you don't know that it is the same tree, you might never think that this could be one and the same individual. And then if you go to fungi and the root of mycelium in the ground that connects different plants, it becomes not at all completely unclear where the individual starts and where the individual ends, or what its shape is. So if you just look at not the most obvious examples of individual animals, if you go outside of that in biology, it's kind of obvious to me that the thing ontology just doesn't work. Where is the thing in this mycelium? Where is the thing in this network of roots, or this plant that is reproducing vegetatively by its rhizome, and then some of the parts of the rhizome get cut? Then is it two plants, or is it one plant, or is it just one big plant? I think by looking at these kind of examples, I think you can make a very strong case for process ontology being necessary to understand biology. In the cases of animals, yeah, there is some discussion possible that there is some essence that the butterfly has and that the caterpillar shares, but when you look at these other cases, then it becomes very difficult to speak about any essence or individual with clear boundaries.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francis. And I will definitely look more deeply into your work on relational agency. So I'm very excited about that. Well, I fully agree with you. And I actually have made that argument in other writings of mine. Well, I have several comments on this. I mean, first, a methodological one. In order to argue against thing ontology, sometimes it might be a good methodological move to make it first as strong as possible in order to destruct it then afterwards. You know, that seems to be a good approach. But then on the other side, you will be surprised how self-confident some of these thing ontologists are, even in the face of all the scenarios that you've just pointed out, right? So, and here again, it becomes crucial to remember. So I make a distinction between two kinds of thing ontology. So the substance sort of ontology and the bundle ontology, right? The neo-Humanian strand. And sometimes they are even combined in the writings of thing ontology. So as they find, well, what fits more at a certain point, they would, you know, either pull out one or the other. So either they would try to argue that even in fungi, there is some essence there that sort of defines then the individual fungus or whatever. I've never got my head around that. Or they will just say, yeah, it's like all these aggregates of atoms. So the real things are just the individuals or the pieces or something. And there is actually some vagueness over there, but we can accommodate this in our account. So that, for example, if you look into writings by Peter van Inwegen, so he has a sort of account. So he talks a lot about vagueness. He generally thinks that objects are just swarms of particles fleeting around. And only in this one particular case of organisms, there is this mystical force of life that somehow, I don't know, forces these particles or atoms into one particular being. And then just because this thing is alive, it's not just like the atomist case where we have a mere aggregate, but it's a real thing, right? And it's never clear really how this can come about and where this mysterious life comes from. So, but here you see an example of how these two different types of ontology, of vision of thing ontology can be combined. So there are all these atoms on the one hand side that just float around and where the boundaries are naturally vague. But at the same time, there is life as a sort of composing force that works top down, and it's just a relic of the Aristotelian soul, living soul, obviously, and the form that forces them together. I don't think this is a convincing approach. I've argued against this at length in a paper where I say that much the account that is much more in line is even actually the only one able to accommodate the empirical findings is the process view, where we can expect that sort of the beginnings and the ends of processes, and also their sort of spatial boundaries in a particular given interaction are vague to some extent, while they actually do have an organizational depth, as I just shortly indicated today as well. So it's not just the sort of accumulation of atoms, right? But there is something going on, something that tries to sustain itself, even though we cannot say exactly where it starts and where it ends, whether this be in time or in space. And I think this, so even in the, so when we actually go into these scenarios that you've just mentioned, I can make, maybe an even stronger point against the thing ontology, despite their very, how you say, imaginative or ambitious attempts to accommodate these things, even in the thing ontological setting.
Well, I admire you for getting into a fight with those hard-headed thing ontologists, because I managed mostly to avoid them, the kind of people that are working within complexity theory and dynamical systems and quantum mechanics. They're not as naive to believe that these particles are really things. So they kind of assume that they are fields or waves or. So yeah, I think it's good to really go into fights with those people. They need to get some hard arguments to change their minds.
But fighting kind of consolidates, yeah. So I don't know.
Yes, it does. Sure.
Fighting is the surest path to like make something stronger. Yeah?
Yeah. Hopefully not in the long run.
So I actually.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could you maybe expand a little bit on the notion of plasticity, particularly as it relates to identity, and do all biological processes have this degree of plasticity? If you could just kind of talk about that a little more.
Oh yeah, thank you. Plasticity. I mean, plasticity is interesting in many different respects. I mean, there is also at different levels of organization. I very, very quickly mentioned freedom. So I think plasticity is a precursor of more robust forms of natural freedom that we can find, in nature. And I'm very permissive here. So I do think that there is some very basic notion of freedom in a cell already. And that has to do with the sort of plasticity it displays, which is, however, I mean, it is sort of primitive as something as complex and exciting as life can be, really. Well, because there is this interaction going on within an environment of, for example, other cells. And if you take the case of development, so this often poses questions. So how does the cell know where to go in developmental process? So how do these cells know what to build, right? At what part, and move there and then differentiate accordingly? So how's this going on? And there is this interesting work by Michael Levin about the electrical signals that cells exchange, and apparently these patterns are inherited and one can manipulate them, and then a certain group of cells builds a different organ at that particular point where they have been manipulated, which is really exciting. I mean, I know that Michael, he is a Platonist, so he thinks there is a morphological space and everything is predefined. So basically through the manipulation, one can sort of just fill the Platonic morphological space that already is there. I have a different view. I think there's really creativity there. Something novel is being created. But that's one aspect of plasticity where it sort of combines with notions of freedom at different levels of organization. I mean, the other interesting aspect is, of course, vagueness, or what we mean by vagueness. Thing ontologists often speak of vagueness when they have to sort of realize that they cannot draw a sharp line between one entity and another, which they would have to do as substance ontologists, right? Because the idea is there are things with neat boundaries, and they are defined by that. So there's a primitive identity, which needs to be presupposed for everything else to make sense, right? So, for example, change. There needs to be an underlying, unchanging substratum of change. And this, people keep telling me, right, that my account of change is wrong, because change means that there is something that doesn't change. And when I tell them, look, this is self-contradictory, they don't want it. They don't get it, right? I don't know, maybe I'm not able to explain it properly, but so, and here plasticity, of course, offers, I mean, it's sort of the opposing stance. So when we acknowledge that something is plastic in a radical sense, then we should include in that it can become something really, really different from what we expect, from what it was before, and so on. And then the question is, okay, is there still identity, right? And the substance ontologist would immediately say to me, if you say there is something that is plastic and it means that it can turn into something rather different, then you're still assuming identity, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to even say what you say, right? Now, my reply to this is, okay, don't fall prey to the sort of logic of Indo-Germanic language, right? We have this sentence structure, right? So there is a noun, and we attribute properties to these nouns. And of course, as we do this, we sort of fix the noun. But this might just be illusory, right? And Henri Bergson has a story about this. He says, well, sort of the way we speak matches with the way we see the world, thanks to how our perception is organized, and especially seeing, so vision has this effect of freezing the change. So it presents something to us which is sort of distant and like shaped and stable, so that we can act upon it. That's the basic idea. And then we distinguish something else from this apparently static image and attribute it as a sort of superficial change. So that's also why when we talk about plasticity, one needs to say what exactly one means by it. And it is as important to distinguish between, for example, to say that something is static or stable. So often people say, well, when you say something is stable, you're sort of granting something to the thing ontologist. And I say no, because stability is not the same as stasis. Stasis is where nothing moves, but stability is a dynamical sort of steady state, right? It's something that is only maintained through constant effort, through constant change. So, and I think the same is true with, applies to plasticity. So also plasticity is not just a property that somehow, I don't know, falls from heaven, right? So it's not that there is an entity, say a cell, and then there's this property plasticity. It's the wrong way to think about it. So there is an underlying substratum, and one of the properties we attribute to it is plasticity. Oh no, then you kind of already, missed the point. So to say that something is plastic is to imply quite a lot, namely that it is in this sort of dynamical state of constantly processually constituted stability in an, as I like to say, interactive stabilization process, which always sort of means there's environment involved. And only because of that is what actually has the plasticity, right? So it's not something that is intrinsic as, again, like an Aristotelian intrinsic potential towards what have you, right? Personality, for example. But it's also something this entity has within a certain context at a certain time due to certain influences. And then it is able in that particular situation to make these perform certain actions that then, for example, drive development. And it is not something, I don't know, attributed to it from without, or being like an essence, or you know, like that itself doesn't change, or something like that. Does that help a little bit?
Oh, yeah, totally. No, that was a great answer. Helps a lot, yeah.
Okay, great.
We have a next person wanting to speak, Angus.
Thank you. And Sophie, I really enjoyed your talk, your presentation. Thank you very much. I think I have way more topics that I would like to discuss with you than would be available in the sociality of this group. But I would like to just string them along, run through them, tell you what they are, and see if any of them are interesting to you. And from my background, first of all, my name is Angus. Angus Jenkinson. My background is from the social practitioner side, not the professional philosopher side, and not biological. But what I've been working with is the identity of organizations, of companies and firms and so on, and distinct from society, so organizations themselves, and specifically the nature of identity, which we can go back to Aristotle on. And this has led me to the conjecture, and now, as it were, working through an hypothesis, developmental description of how we can go from the notion that maybe biology can be considered to be an analogy for how social organizations of those kinds work, to actually saying, no, it's actually an ontological basis for thinking about how social organizations work. And identity certainly involves all of the various aspects of dynamics of process and change that you talk about. So I also come from a background in which I've worked with Maturana and Varela and autopoiesis, and have both been very much inspired, but also have certain critiques on them, on, for example, mechanism that you also referred to later. And I'm also deeply involved in the cybernetic tradition and see that. From that point of view, for 50 years, I've been contra the orthodox model of science and the orthodox structure of science, while being deeply interested in science. So that's a kind of little bit about how I approach these things. And that's why I agree with so much of what you said and enjoyed so much of what you said. So here's some points. One, Aristotle, entelechy, you mention it. Entelechy as a translation has gone down through the centuries in a particular form through the translation route of Aristotle. But I'm not sure if you're familiar with the translator Joe Sachs and his translations of Aristotle, because if you're not, I think you would love them. Joe Sachs approaches it in a very interesting way directly with the Greek, and his translation is, he talks about it as entelecheia, and the translation is being at work, staying itself. He explains how the word is a uniting, a portmanteau word of different forms, and it has this translation, being at work, staying itself. And as such, it is the fundamental concept, as he sees it in Aristotle. Now, being at work, staying itself is very different from the normal description of entelechy and telos and so forth. The telos is being, staying itself, and it's very, very relevant to what you've been exploring in the nature of process on the one hand, identity on the other hand, and structure on the third. And when he talks about soul, ousia, when you talk about substance, his ousia, he translates that Sachs as thinghood. But what he means by thinghood is something that is not reducible to attributes, but actually represents a fullness of being. And one of the things that I would say is that in your description, you contra all the way through thing ontology, which I completely agree with, but you never question, okay, how are you going to compare it with beinghood as a way of saying? So how would you relate it to that? And that's, I think, an interesting question. And so that the way of ousia being translated as substance is also, you can see that as an historical translation that's been perpetuated. It's an example of identity through time, but in the cognitive realm. And it's a misunderstanding, I think, fundamentally of what the original Greek was. So the next question is flux and change. You talk a lot about change, and quite rightly, but there is a distinction maybe between flux and change. There's all of the flux, which you, for example, the river, the images you had of waves moving and so on, which are basically just all of the kinds of movements of flux, which is very different from the transformational nature of genuine change. And where I come from there is in the design of change in social environments, whereby an intervention that is relatively simple, we can bring about a complete flip of the whole situation as it is understood. And from that point of view, it leads to the whole notion of the author. So much of what is going on in modern science and philosophy is rooted in the kind of orthodoxy that was born around 1600. And so often it's attempts to compete against that orthodoxy and contra that orthodoxy, but is using the very terms and language and formulations and concepts that that orthodoxy produced in the first place. You know, so it's based on a resolution down into physics and how you can structure them in physics and so on. So what we've got, I think, is the necessity to be able to see alternative ways of describing reality that are not inconsistent with each other, but give you very different pictures of what is going on, very different understandings of what is going on, which in turn relates to the ability to filter the world in different ways, to filter the world by looking at, for example, its physical structures, its process structures, to be able to look at its conceptual structures. You're moving into the cognitive realm. That's the next area of what you want to work with. So I think this ability to filter different realms and describe them in different ways, which in turn leads to the idea that there's more than one form of causality. If we're only using the kinds of causality that comes from physics, which is a cause and effect causality, we'll never be able to understand life, because life is not based on that kind of cause and effect causality, but a different one. Choices you've talked about, agency and so on. This leads to a different mode of causality and a different way of thinking about the very nature of regularities in science. And instead of looking at science as a series of a calculus based on that kind of cause and effect structure, maybe we need to think in terms of other ways of thinking about it. And then I'm interested in that context, because you talk about identity a lot, why the word metamorphosis never appeared in any of your description. Because for me, the Goethean model and people like Bortoft and so on working with that is a really helpful way of thinking about this, and actually the ability to directly perceive it at, as you say, a higher order way of observing. I totally agree with you about mechanism. And one of the things that I've been exploring is the alternative to thinking about mechanism in this context of the social and the organic life. And what is the substitute for mechanism? Because mechanism is a false route for explaining things. So all of these different areas, for me, it's a fascinating thing that you brought. I think it's really important that we engage with what you are leading into. And I think there's very, very much more that we can engage with. And I see revolutionary stuff happening in the next few decades.
Great. If I can be part of the revolution, I'm certainly up for it. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a whole bunch of interesting considerations, and I would really start from the beginning when it comes to Aristotle. Actually, it is important to make a distinction here really between what is called substance ontology and the specific case of Aristotelian substance ontology. And I could even say, well, one even needs to distinguish between what is today sold as Aristotelian, say neo-Aristotelian, and then of course the question, what the historical Aristotle taught. So what is really in his writings, and then it might be quite a different thing what people made of it, and then again how it sort of lived on in other theories. I mentioned substratum theory, right? Substratum theory is not the same as Aristotelian substance ontology. Aristotle does not assume that there is a bare particular, right? It's sort of a descendant of the original Aristotelian claim, which I think has more plausibility than the substratum theory. When it comes to this translation of entelechy, being at work.
Being at work, staying itself.
Yes. Well, the thing is, okay, but I think I would like to add, in order to make it a true entelechy, it should not be being at work, staying itself, but being at work in order to stay itself, because this is teleological for Aristotle, right? And then
I would agree with that. He's just giving you the direct translation of the portmanteau of the words. So it doesn't have in order to, but yes.
Okay, yeah, but then of course, the telos is something for Aristotle that moves, right? So a living being is moved by the telos it has, and the telos is determined by the essence of the animal, say, right?
Yes, so it's not something outside, it's something within its own nature.
Yes, it is in its nature, which is the meaning of what essence, right? And entirely, so it's in it. It's its natural goal, so to speak, but it is something that provides a direction for the activity that's going on, right? And I'm happy to grant this type of activity. That is really in the historical Aristotle. So
it's consistent with autopoiesis.
No, and here's the difference now, and that's really important. This is why I talked about the principle of activity, right? So this is the sort of modern analytic metaphysics interpretation of Aristotelian entelechy, right? The problem is, so in this being at work, in order to stay itself, what it means to stay itself is something that is already sort of virtually there, because it is predetermined by the kind of entelechy the thing has, right? So the dog, for example, has a particular entelechy to being at work in order to stay itself. In order to stay a dog, and let's say a dog is a four-legged animal that barks and whatever would actually hunt if in the wild, and whatever you would add, right? It has fur, it's nice, and I have one lying here next to me. So, but this is something that sort of is determined already by the fact that this particular dog has a dog soul, right? Which structures then the organization in accordance. And whether this dog now is in the developing state, like as an embryo, or whether it actually is already, kind of jumping around and engaging in activity, it will always, whatever it does, whatever activity you find, is directed towards something that is already, like defined. It is determined already. And there is no explanation as to why does this particular being have that particular structure? Why does it have this entelechy? Why does it have this particular soul? So the only answer is, okay, because it has inherited this soul from its father, right? But there's no other story that could explain to us how this higher order structure, an organizational principle that guides the activity of that being in question, how this comes about. And I think the processual account gives this story, right? Because here the idea is, okay, this particular form or structure a being has, which makes it in a certain sense, with caveats, I talked about plasticity and vagueness and everything, that makes it sort of recognizable through time, re-identifiable in some sense over time. That is the result, the outcome of a continuous process of interactive self-stabilization. And we can describe the different kinds of changes, right, that have to occur for this stability to obtain, right?
Agreed.
And this is the difference, right? And all I want to say is there's a difference between a process account and the historical Aristotle. I think Aristotle is great, and he's much greater than what, like people made of him.
I'm not trying to resurrect Aristotle and say he knows all the answers.
This is fine.
Yeah.
I'm just, there is this, when it comes to making historically true interpretative claims, then I would like to point out, even though I acknowledge that there is the processual element in Aristotle, and the translations like the one that you referred to really pick out something that matches and sort of really highlights something in Aristotle that we should recognize, a sort of activity there. There is something from just my point of view missing in that account, where I just think it's not satisfactory, right? And this is what I went over this very quickly due to limited time, right? The explanatory frustration. So if you ask, okay, why does this dog have the soul it has, or then there is no answer.
But he doesn't, of course, mean by soul. He doesn't actually mean soul the way we would understand soul today. I mean,
no,
a magnet has a soul.
Fine with it.
It means organization.
Yes,
the way it's organized.
Why does it have this organization? There's no answer.
Yeah.
And it's clear why not. And I don't blame Aristotle for it.
I think he sees it as kind of precipitating from being. That's
he just thinks that species are eternal. I mean, and that's why evolution.
Because the being is eternal. Perhaps. I don't know. Either.
Well, I mean, this is now, I don't know.
But I don't know either. I'm not saying. But what about metamorphosis?
Okay, just one last word on Aristotle. I mean, this is, and we have to acknowledge that he was sort of the first biologist on record, right? I mean, all these biological writings by Aristotle, and I mean,
amazing.
He did things that, were sort of pioneering work at the time, and just amazing. But he couldn't know. I mean, he didn't have the concept of evolution, right? No. He thought species are eternal, and so every member of the species, I mean,
he didn't even have microscopes.
Oh yes, no. As I said, I don't blame him. That's just. But it is important to see, right, that there is this difference, right? Yes. So this is the historical Aristotle. It was before evolutionary theory, and now we're after evolutionary theory. I'm saying something here. So evolutionary theory was sort of
your points on evolutionary theory were well made, I think.
And now we got to the point where people realize that the sort of orthodox evolutionary theory is maybe somehow deficient, something is actually missing, and thereby, and this sort of missing thing there actually causes evolutionary theory to be even misleading in some respects. And this is why I talked about genetic essentialism and all the sort of dangers that follow from that. Beinghood, I want to say something about that, and translation of ousia. So sure, this is sort of an unfortunate historical contingency that ousia was translated as a substance. But of course, the substance is not actually the translation of ousia, which is essence, but it's often confused. It's the translation of hypokeimenon. And Aristotle does talk about the hypokeimenon, which is the underlying. If you read the categories, so then this is there, right? So substance, modern talk of substance refers to hypokeimenon, which is the underlying of all the other categories, right? So you have the first ousia and the second ousia, so which is the individual and the species, and all the other categories, the when and where and so on, the activity, they are attributed to that hypokeimenon. And this is also where sort of the link lies between the modern substratum theory and substance ontology. I mean, I'm not Aristotelian substance ontology. I think, and that's one last word on this historical Aristotle question, which is an interesting one. There is an ongoing debate among Aristotle scholars about how to understand being and ousia, and they recognize that there's a difference between how ousia is presented in the categories and in metaphysics. So the metaphysics, the book, so to speak, which Aristotle wrote after the categories according to the sort of consensus. And so there might be a difference there, which might be important to appreciate.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I said a lot already. I don't know whether there are more questions from other people. I don't want to take up all the time.
Thank you so much.
I don't have a problem with metamorphosis. I mean, we can talk about metamorphosis, but yes, one thought about change, right? In Aristotle, there is this difference, of course, between sort of change as alteration, accidental change, I mentioned it, and what is often called substantial change. So like when I really cease to exist, if I were to turn in a cat or whatever, right? But the problem is that in Aristotle, you cannot really connect these two changes. I mean, he does have a complicated theory about generation and corruption. One of his writings has that title, but
But you can in cybernetics.
Okay, that is yet another big discussion. I feel like we should defer this to a private conversation. But the point for me as a process ontologist is that in my account, there is a sort of gradual transition between what Aristotle would call a substantial change and an accidental change. It's not that, you can draw a sharp distinction, and cases of metamorphosis might be exactly such cases, right? Where we can have a long argument about, is this now accidental change or not? I'm not such a friend of the idea of alteration, because it really suggests a model where you have a sort of self-identical substratum, the hypocamenon that stays the same, and just some accidental change. So I don't think this is a helpful model. I would always point out with Bergson that it sort of rests on an illusion that we create ourselves by the way we perceived about, which has a pragmatic sense, which is to sort of facilitate actions. In order to be able to act upon something, Bergson says we need to have mechanisms in place to stabilize that thing. But okay, this is another great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I may, I just wanted to add a short comment about this Aristotle duality of his existence. I think it's a wonderful illustration of the difference between the thing ontology and process ontology, is because we have like a physical entity, Aristotle, somewhere, like who knows what he was thinking, yes, and we have and how able he was to put his thinking in actual like linguistic forms faithfully, yes, or just because it sometimes is there are conventions and there's perceptions, and it's not one-to-one correspondence. So there is a person, yes, so and in itself a process, yes, but then you have another process which we call Aristotle in philosophy, which is like an ongoing heuristic, yes, an attribution of meanings and like thinking anchored in the symbol, yes, and so it's very interesting in like the human realm and cultural and social realm, the consequences of thinking in terms of process ontology, because the process Aristotle is very much alive, yes, and changing all the time, or kind of like we try to change it, yes, occasionally. So just a comment on that. It's actually a beautiful illustration to the point you are making.
Yeah, you're right. And in some distant future, I might work out a process epistemology. So, because I'm quite on board with that.
And finally, you arrive at a different meaning of the soul, because if he still exists as a process, yeah, we might call that a soul. Yeah, so like haunting. Just present. Any other comments, questions? Francis.
Well, two questions about related philosophies. One that we have briefly discussed in the previous seminar, the object-oriented ontology, which apparently was claimed is not really a thing ontology, but is closer to the process ontology. I'm not convinced. And the second one, the philosophy of the Tao, the Chinese philosophy of Taoism, which sounds very similar to Heraclitus and the process view of nature. So how would you interpret those two in terms of process ontology? On the one hand, the object-oriented ontology, on the other hand, the ontology of Taoism.
I think you need to tell me more about the first one.
Well, that is apparently very popular in metaphysics recently, and it's the idea that there are objects, but these objects are defined in such an abstract way that they could potentially be events or processes. And the idea is that the objects have some independent existence, and that we should understand reality as an interaction between these objects, so that it's not like in the linguistic term of recent philosophy, that everything is about epistemology, but that we want to reintroduce metaphysics as objects interacting, but in such a way that they're almost like processes. But I'm not a specialist myself, so that's why I hope that you would be able to illuminate.
Oh, okay. So is that in the tradition of analytic metaphysics? It sounds to be more like a little bit continental. Do you have any names for me? So
Yes, always was speaking about. Let me look at what was the author who's associated with that.
Was kind of putting it together with this Luhmannian approach of like observing objects, is that you that the subject of observation becomes an object, something like that. But
Graham Harman seems to be the guy, object-oriented ontology 000.
Yes.
okay, can you put the name in the chat?
Yes, I'm a bit familiar also with object-oriented ontology and Taoism, but Taoism doesn't start off with the modern scientific view that the world is assembled out of bits and pieces and in parts, and then they're assembled into larger wholes, and we call that emergence. And that, in a sense, you are also contradicting, I believe, and Sophie, and so does Taoism. And so I think does cybernetics when it's properly understood, but it's often not properly understood. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, my relationship with objects is like, I think I pointed this out, what is it supposed to be, right? So is it then in the sense of things? And then I told you what I think about things. If the meaning is supposed to be the literal one about something being objected, so then we need the subject as well.
He's turning anything into an object, and I think you would end up refuting him if from my.
I will look into this and then give another talk on that. I don't know, but okay. So for an object, you need to have a subject as well, and then this might be a complicated theory there, but I have too little basis now to really comment on it. I think within the boundaries of analytic metaphysics, this literal notion of an object is not so much reflected upon, right? Objects are just things, basically, something we can point towards, and the fact that a subject is there as well, in order for that, needs to be there in order for that to be an object, that is not so much something people are interested in, even though I happen to think it's important. And that's why I like Bergson in that respect, because he tells us that what objects, appear to us to be has to do with the way how we interact with them. And this is not a story as, for example, Kant would tell it, like where you end up with some sort of constructivism that can only be grounded in very bold metaphysical claims about the nature of, I don't know, humans and human perception and intellect or something. But Bergson's story is one about agency, right? So the idea is we are agents in an environment with which we have interacted and always are interacting already before we actually become self-aware. And so this world of interaction is pretty much real. So it's not just a transcendental idea, it's like a thing in itself or something that we construe, or where we have to sort of jump into it by just postulating it. It is something that's real and explains why we are there, but at the same time, because of the interaction, it also appears to us in a certain way. And that, for Bergson, explains a lot about the sort of puzzles that come up in metaphysics, right? So, for example, this struggle between idealism and realism. So he explains it by that. And I would think also the whole idea of four-dimensionalism versus substance ontology, right? It's one of those oppositions or antagonisms that in the end are just illusory. So none of them is right and somehow understands properly what reality is like, because both in the actually presuppose something that for Bergson is an abstraction. So the idea that there are these, as a primitive given, stable things, right? And that is, I hope, I think looking into biology, it is not so hard to make the case that this cannot be true. And then that we have very good reason to believe that this is something that we make up. It's the outcome of abstraction, really. But I see that it's a hand. Yeah.
Don.
Hi, and thank you so much. I'm just a biologist, so, but very convinced.
What do you mean by just a biologist?
Okay. Well, speaking of just the biologist, I have a question about your statement about you becoming a cat. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Mm.
Yeah. I don't understand why it would be necessary to say that if you became a cat, you said you would cease to exist.
Oh, no, Aristotle says that.
Oh,
not me,
sorry.
Aristotle.
No, because if you became a cat, you would be you that became a cat. That's maybe statistically unlikely and not predictable on a population level, but you would simply be you that became a cat. I mean, it's...
Yeah, so I mean, try to explain this to Aristotle, not to me. So Aristotle thinks it can't be, because there is a natural limit to the changes a substance can undergo. And this limit is set by the essence it has, and that is by the kind of soul, and which we can translate to by the kind of organization this being has, where organization, in that case, for Aristotle as a form, is something that works top down, right? So there's matter, so in this hylomorphism picture, so there's matter which actually comes with some sort of potential, but it's not sort of, like a differentiated already. It's sort of mere potential, mere stuff, right? And then there comes form that informs the matter, so to turn it into something that then actually is structured. And it's very important to note that in Aristotle, really, because people this is nice about Aristotle, he talks about that and the structure and organization and so on. But then there is this temptation to turn him into a sort of modern biologist, which he isn't, right? He gave us an explanation, and some parts of it are useful because, I subscribe to the fact, to the idea that there is top-down causation, right? But in an organism, I don't have any problem with that. But I also recognize there's upward causation as well. And these two are intermingled in an interesting sense. This is why I quoted Dennis Noble, right? This is what he pointed out as well. So multi-level, multi-directional causation. So we have to have a story about emergence there as well. Right. So this can be misleading in other. So, okay, coming back to the cat. So for us, this is not possible, right? Because a cat is a different species. I'm a human. So that means I'm rational. I have 2 legs, and I don't know what else is part of it. For sure, for Aristotle, I would lose my rationality if I were to turn to a cat. So I wouldn't turn into a cat. I would cease to exist. You see? So this is really, and it's crucial. This is why I chose this example. This is Aristotle. This is what he thinks. Okay.
Yeah.
But are you seriously suggesting it's possible to turn into a cat and still be you, Anne-Sophie?
Oh, I'm not suggesting this. This was just a made-up example in order to illustrate the point. And now I see that.
No, but
isn't that exactly the point that, it's like God can't create a square circle. It goes with your whole organization, that you're organized in a particular way. And you have to be organized in the way you are to be what you are. And if you were organized in another way, then something would emerge from that. Something would exist in that would have a different organizational process constituency.
But may I push the point though? The first thing that came to mind was, if I said that to my colleagues in South America, and I do a lot of work in Latin America, especially to my indigenous colleagues, and said, well, if I became a jaguar, I would cease to exist, they would look at me as astonishing.
Yeah, of course.
No, and that is absolutely real to them. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for me, as I'm going to say, a Westerner, and not just an American. I'm just steeped in this Greco-Roman philosophy. And
Okay.
anyway,
I see the
I'm
point.
not as sophisticated as you guys are, but I
have 2 comments. Thank you, Don. So one is, of course, we need to be careful here. You mentioned the Western Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Of course, it's easy, once you assume there is a soul that is separate from the body, then of course you can also imagine becoming an animal. This is not the kind of metamorphosis, thanks for the term, that we're interested in now, right?
Why does the soul have to be separate, though?
No, it doesn't have to be. Oh, no, wait. But there's a tradition, of course. I mean, if you think about the possibility of afterlife, for example, right? So once you take it to be possible for the soul to survive the death of the body, right? I mean, that's a Platonic dualistic tradition. Then I should mention Descartes here.
Sorry, I'm way too simple. I'm sorry to throw you guys into this.
No, that's fine. So look, and then of course, if you have that kind of picture, again, it's easy to imagine becoming an animal. So if you just imagine you don't end up in heaven, but your soul is just, going into some different body. But that's not the thing I'm interested in. I think the question was raised here is a true metamorphosis. And I mean, I don't know about the evolutionist theory there. It might be that kind of theory where you have a soul that just, changes bodies, right? And has different corporal lives and something like that. But the thing we are interested in here is whether a true metamorphosis is possible. Right. And so the question that I've been asked is whether I, as a process ontologist, should not subscribe to that view. And here's what I would like to reply. So I briefly mentioned Michael Levin and his work, where he showed that through simple manipulations of the signaling patterns of cells in a developing organism, you can create something new. Right? So he created worms with two heads, and there are legs somewhere where they don't, you can play around with that, right? And so I don't have any problem with that as a process ontologist. I think I can provide a theory for why this is the case, right? Or why it's
sure.
I would interpret this a little bit differently from the way Michael does, because I'm not a Platonist. I don't think that the space is predefined and we're just filling the space with our manipulation. But okay, maybe this in the end doesn't matter so much, because there's a question, what does it mean that there is something? And sure, I also acknowledge that there are physical laws that shape the possibilities that we actually have when we manipulate morphology. However, so okay, I would stress the creativity of the process and the novelty. But I also recognize, I mean, normally in the mature form of an organism like me, as I'm sitting in front of you as a middle-aged woman, I don't know what kind of manipulation would have to go on in order to turn me into something completely different. So maybe I should talk to Michael about it, and he will come up with a device, something to turn me into something else. I'm not sure I want to undergo this experiment, but it's not that likely, because I mean, I have lost a certain sort of plasticity right now. I mean, there's ongoing research about what to do, when it comes to cancer research and all these things. I mean, this is about basically bringing back some of the plasticity that mature organisms like us have lost, and to reverse something that happened in our bodies. So, but otherwise, so my answer is, in general, all sorts of creative developments of something new and really, really novel is possible, and I can explain it in processual terms. When it comes to humans turning into cats, I would just like to point out it's not that likely, and we would to devise really surprising methods to make it happen.
Thank you. You gave this very eye-opening. It's wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Anne-Sophie. It's time for us to wrap up already. So I thank you and everybody else for the participation. And
thanks very much for having me and for the great discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.